Are you looking for details of the most beautiful weekend hikes in South East Queensland and further afield? Well, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Everyday Hiker podcast. My name is Beck and I'm your host. Join me and my guest hikers as we share amazing locations, practical tips and guides for new hikers, as well as those with some more experience looking for inspiration. And please, if you like what you hear, follow me, share with your friends, rate my podcast and send me your feedback. Okay, hello. And today I'm going to be talking about somewhere outside of South East Queensland. So whilst my intention initially was to cover as many really lovely South East Queensland walks that I could, I also wanted to talk about other destinations that you could consider, whether it was for a weekend away or even longer. And somewhere that I went earlier this year that I thought was worth sharing was a very short trip to the Blue Mountains. But for me, the Blue Mountains is just one of those locations that if you love your hiking and your bushwalking, it is just a mecca. And really, it's not that far away if you live in Brisbane or South East Queensland to get away for what we did was a 4-day over a long weekend in May. But I think you could really do it for just a 2 to 3 day weekend as well. And one of the reasons for that is that if you can fly into Sydney, the freeway from Sydney out to the base of the Blue Mountains or even up to the Blue Mountains is really quick, particularly if you're going, in a non-peak hour traffic situation. And it's basically an hour and a half from the airport right through to the Blue Mountains. So it's a pretty quick drive. The other thing is it is accessible by train. Will take you about double that time because you've got to get the train from the airport to the station and from the station up to Katoomba, but a pretty low hassle way to go by the train and also pretty cheap. It's only about $60 return on the train and you don't have to worry about things like traffic or getting the car back in time. However, one of the downsides of catching the train, and we did initially contemplate that, but when you get to the Blue Mountains itself, there's a number of townships that I'll talk about today, and each of them have a station, but those stations are quite a walk away from the most popular trailheads. And even though there's some local buses that you could jump onto and Ubers operate up there, by the time you start adding up the cost of those Ubers, taxis, train tickets, bus tickets, the car might just be logistically a lot easier to have to get you around. So there's two main roads up to the Blue Mountains, and the first one comes off that freeway and is freeway-like in nature, heading straight up to Katoomba. The other alternative is to go up or down the Blue Mountains via the Greater Bells line of road, which is a real change of scenery, a lot slower and more scenic, I'd argue, than the highway way as the main way in. And it's also got a lot of lovely local history and farmland. So what we did after we had jumped in the car, had a fantastic run out to Windsor, the town at the base of the mountains, we headed up the Greater Bells line of road and decided just to mosey our way up on that first day. And really, we were up there by lunchtime, and then we had the whole afternoon. Now, I have to confess that one of the reasons I was going up this road wasn't for any bushwalking reasons. It's because there's two fabulous cider places up there, Hillbilly Cider and the Bilpin Cider Company. Both of them were just gorgeous locations, really worth a visit, and we stopped at both. But not far from Bilpin, up the road, you get a great introduction to the views in the Blue Mountains. There's two shortish trails, less than 3 kilometres both ways, at Mount Banks or the Walls Lookout. So both of those give you a view of the valley of the other direction than what you're going to see, say, looking out to the Three Sisters. But really nice short walks. You keep going up that road and turn sort of left, you verge to the left to head towards Toowoomba. And another real highlight of this afternoon was to stop at the town of Mount Victoria. The town has just a magnificently restored hotel, really harking back to the early 1900s, almost sort of jazz era in its renovations. See if you can get a sneak peek of the bedrooms because they really are magnificent. There's also great antique shops and one of Australia's oldest running cinemas there as well. So from Mount Victoria, we headed into where we were staying for the next few nights. But as sunset was coming up, we headed down to the Three Sisters Lookout near Katoomba. This is always busy. There are just always busloads of people, but particularly at sunset, so finding a spot was a bit of a challenge. But if you can stay for dusk and maybe have something to eat, there's food trucks and a cafe and whatever down there. Something that's really worth doing. It's short, but another way to get a walk in on the first day is to do the floodlit night walk from that area, or the Katoomba Falls Kiosk car park. It's only 1.5 kilometres, the loop, but it's floodlit. The paths are floodlit all the way along. And then when you get to the Katoomba Cascades, which is a very pretty sort of small waterfall, it's all floodlit down the falls on either side of a little pedestrian bridge. So it's just something different to do a walk at night that's all lit up, and it's extremely pretty. The second day we headed into one of the town's Lura. They were having their weekly food market, so that made them a great place to head to for breakfast. But also there was a trail that I wanted to go and have a look at that started from Gladstone Road, which was just outside of town. You could definitely walk there if you didn't have transport. This links the pools of Siloam, I think that's how you say it, with the Lyrebird Dell. It's a well-marked trail, and there's really nice views from Gladstone Road. You're walking down the cliff and descending into a valley, and at the bottom of the valley are the pools themselves, which are very scenic. You see pictures of them in some of the Blue Mountains paraphernalia around, mossy and, large pools, waterfall at the back. So from there you cross over the pools and you head up another cliff, and you sort of circuit around the Lyrebird Dell picnic area. And as the name suggests, this is a really great place to see a lyrebird, but probably more early morning. And we weren't so lucky, no matter how much we looked. We did see lots of other bird life, though. There were so many birds on this trail, probably the best one, actually, to see birds. And in particular, we saw a heap of really large black cockatoos. But from the Lyrebird Dell, there was another area that I wanted to see. It's the Lone Pine area. So this area is dedicated to the men from Lura who fought in World War I. And initially a single pine tree was planted there in their honour after the war. But since then, they've actually planted a whole bunch more pine trees, in fact, one for each of the men that lost their lives. And also a staircase has been decorated with plaques and tiles, all commemorating their names and the war itself. And it's just, a really novel area. I can imagine it would be a fantastic place to spend Anzac Day, and just something a little bit different in the Blue Mountains. From there, you walk down, you keep going down those stairs, you come to another waterfall, and eventually you come back to the pools of Siloam, and then you're crossing over and back up the cliff to your car. That was a really nice walk. The whole circuit was only about 6.5 kilometres, but it was a little bit different to what we would be seeing in the next couple of days. And that afternoon, we decided to drive down to the Megalong Valley. And on the way down the mountain, there's another lovely short walk to do. It doesn't actually have a name, but the signpost as you're heading down from Katoomba down the road to the Megalong Valley. And there's a real mystical feel to these trails in here. There's a creek running like waterfalls through the middle, but it's very much a moss-covered forest. The air is really heavy with moisture. There's trees draping foliage down the sides of boulders, etc. And it's a fungi lover's paradise. I've never seen so many growths, including a mushroom. So if that's your thing, this is a great little short trail for something completely different in the Blue Mountains. The main reason we wanted to go down to the Megalong Valley is that it's so completely different from up in the mountains. It is grassy plains and that gorgeous Australian bush with the single, grey ghost gums. And there's so many farms down here. There is a cafe that has a fabulous reputation for lunch, but we stopped at the tea rooms, which is a real must, to grab a cuppa. They've got really lovely gardens to sit in. And then we headed up to have a look at the start of the 6-foot track. I definitely want to do the 6-foot track as a separate trip. At the moment, the 6-foot track connects ultimately Katoomba, we head up the mountain through behind that road and through those trails I talked about. But it also connects on the other side to Jenolan Caves, and that part of the walk is closed. So you can only get so far and then you have to turn back. There is a lodge there, the 6-foot lodge, to stay in. But I thought, well, I'll wait until the caves are open and do the whole thing. Having said that, though, there was a number of hikers around. I don't know whether they were just doing day trips or heading into the lodge itself. There were also horse riders. And we found that as when we went to the start of the 6-foot track, there was a winery not far from there, a short walk in, and it was the most stunning scenery, I think, that I've seen from a winery. It just had those Blue Mountains vistas in the background. The horses were tied up. People were sitting around in the sun with their packs, their hiking packs next to them. And it was great wine. It was a great grazing platter to sit and munch on. And it's really nice down at the Megalong Valley. They've got horses, just something different in the Blue Mountains. So day 3, we had some friends coming up from Sydney to join us, and they'd suggested we walk the Grand Canyon track, and boy, was I glad that we did. This is probably one of the most beautiful tracks I've ever walked. It's located outside the town of Blackheath, and you would definitely need a car or at least like an Uber or taxi to get you to the start, because it's quite a way out of Blackheath, like a few kilometres at least, to get to the start of the trailhead. And then it's not that great in distance, but it feels a lot longer because you're walking down into the canyon bottom and back up again, and you stop so many times. There's so much to see that it actually does take a fair few hours to do this track. And I can't imagine you want to add too much to that at the start or the end, walking in and out to that car park. It is a popular track. It wasn't too bad. We went on a Sunday. We just needed a little bit of patience. Sometimes there were sort of narrow staircases and you had to stop to let people past. But once you're on the canyon floor, the scenery is just really breathtaking. There's stepping stones over creeks, there's water bridges to cross, there's overhanging cliffs dripping with water that you have to duck under. You can gaze up, chasms where there's abseilers coming down. It really is just super pretty. There's so much to look at. The vegetation's really lush and green. There's ferns everywhere. And the water in the creek that's flowing through is really clear. It's very fast flowing. We spotted the local crayfish. You can't miss them because they're bright orange. And we also enjoyed watching so many birds dipping into the water. As you climb out of the canyon, the trail becomes more bush-like and winds around the cliffs to the car park, but there are some great views here as well to look over the valley. I would just say if you're going to the Blue Mountains, this is a trail you don't want to miss. Obviously, if you could do it midweek, you would avoid it being so popular. And the circuit's about 8 kilometres. As I said, it probably takes you a little bit longer than what that suggests because you're stopping so much. Now, given this track is so close to Blackheath, that's where we went after walking. There's a great Art Deco pub in town where we had lunch. And one thing that I thought I'd mention, because we were there in autumn, in May, which is a really popular time to go to the Blue Mountains, the streets of Blackheath are lined with mostly Japanese maples. So when they're in full bloom in the middle of autumn, as they were when we were there, it really is a spectacular sight. And one thing that gave us a bit of a chuckle was the number of tourists taking photos for Instagram, no doubt, to the point where it was almost tricky to drive down some of the streets. But if you're looking for that autumn colour in the Blue Mountains, Blackheath is the town to go to. So on day 4, and we needed to head back to the airport for mid-afternoon, so we had left our last trail to be another really popular one, but because it was a Monday morning by then, it wasn't a public holiday in New South Wales. We went to Wentworth Falls and decided to descend to the bottom. And as you start out, there's a Wentworth Falls lookout and you head across to the falls themselves. You cross the falls. When you get to the other side, there's 2 more lookouts that you can sort of climb up to. But then really what you're doing is you're walking around the cliff to start to descend the grand stairway. This is a highlight of a visit to the Blue Mountains. It's unbelievable to think that what is said to be the largest outdoor staircase in Australia It was, built by hand in the early 1900s. It's been restored recently, but down the bottom or the mid-level of the falls, there's some photos down there showing tourists from the early 1900s and these ladies in their long dresses, and you think, how on earth did they get down such a steep and narrow staircase? It's certainly an experience and one worth not to miss. Once again, it's narrow, so you might get a few people passing you, but you wind down that very steep, but with a handrail all the way, so even though you're on the edge of the cliff, it feels very safe. You head down to what is the mid-level of the falls, and there's some really big boulders here to sit on and gaze up at the falls, which are an astonishing drop of water from the top where you started. We were a bit disappointed because you can actually keep going across the falls again, and there's another leg you can go down to the lower part of the falls, but that was closed and apparently had been closed for some time with no update on when it might open again. If you are there and that's open, I definitely suggest going down. Once again, more steep staircases, this time metal ones with cages around them, but I think that's half the adventure to get down there. And when you get to the bottom, apparently you can swim. It's got a much darker canopy than where you are higher up in the falls. And from there you either climb back up, as we did, right to the top, or you can actually keep going on a much longer national trail, which is quite a day walk if you choose that. But like I said, we headed back up the grand stairway and thought, well, that's not that long a walk if you're only going to the mid-levels, so why don't we keep going and have a look around at some of the other trails. So you may be aware that there is a grand clifftop walk that was finished last year. They'd spent some time restoring, including that grand stairway, all the handrails and repairing all the trails and building some new features to make them safe. So that grand clifftop walk basically links the towns of Wentworth Falls, Leura and Katoomba. So we had done parts of those being in Leura and Katoomba, and so we decided to do a bit more of the Wentworth Falls side of it. So there's a track called the Undercliff Overcliff track, and as the name suggests, partly you're walking over the top of the cliff, and then at other times you're walking under the overhanging cliffs to get around the cliff, and then you head down a little bit more into a valley and or a gorge on the other side. We walked this track for about another 6 kilometres, and we walked as far as the Conservation Hut, which is a renovated walker's hut from times past, but now it's a very modern cafe, although the walls are adorned with photos from bushwalkers of past in the Blue Mountains, but they serve really delicious food and coffee. So after a morning of ascending that steep staircase at Wentworth Falls and then going along this Undercliff Overcliff track, it was really welcome to have a coffee. And from here, rather than having to repeat that whole track and go back, there's sort of a shortcut track that cuts straight across back to the Wentworth Falls car park, and that sort of ended the day. So all up, the circuit was about 8 kilometres and took us a few hours. And like I said, from here we headed back to Sydney Airport. So in total we spent 4 days away, but I think you could compress this itinerary and do it in 3 days because we didn't have particularly long days on any one of them. The other thing I would say, though, is that we had been to the Blue Mountains quite a number of times before, so we weren't looking to do Scenic World, which is where you might see the cable car and the vertical train going down the mountain. So you might have to build them into your itinerary if it was the first time that you did it. The reason we didn't do the Grand Clifftop Walk and tackled it in smaller parts is because you would need to leave a car or organise a taxi because it's a one-way walk. I think it's 19 kilometres in total, so unless you had the time to do 38 kilometres in a day, you're sort of starting at Wentworth Falls, so you've got to get yourself down to the first town. Then they're suggesting you stay in the middle at Leura, and then the next day go on to Katoomba, and then you've got to get back from Katoomba. So just logistically check that out if that's something that's appealing to you, or you can do like we did, you can do it in parts. Look, there are so many amazing walks to choose from in the Blue Mountains areas. Honestly, having gone for 4 days, I'm already planning the next trip that we could go back and do some more of them for a longer time frame. There's some really adventurous ones there as well that involve wading through canyons, abseiling or climbing quite steep mountains. There's a lot with really exposed cliffs too, looking those magnificent views over the valleys. I think you could happily spend a week there and still find walks to discover. As even though we're not talking about South East Queensland, I hope what I've talked about today has given you a taste of an itinerary that you could do as a special trip south from this region, maybe for a great long weekend like we did. So thank you very much for listening. As always, you'll find details of the trails and locations discussed today in the show notes, and I'd love to hear from you, so please leave me your feedback, suggestions or ideas, and I'd really appreciate if you could rate me, follow me or share with your friends. Thank you and happy hiking.